Sup, chooms? How y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, a couple of weeks ago, something interesting happened. Someone wrote a comment asking why I have never covered the subject of PSSD. For those who don't know, PSSD is an acronym that refers to Post-SSRI Sexual Dysfunction. SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors. SSRIs are basically antidepressants that are commonly prescribed to treat a variety of mental health disorders that cause depression and anxiety. It has been long known that SSRIs can cause sexual dysfunction, including delayed orgasm. In fact, some SSRIs are even prescribed for this specific side effect. For example, duloxetine, which is a weak SSRI marketed as Prilogy, is approved for the treatment of premature ejaculation. Unfortunately, unless you are suffering from premature ejaculation, taking an SSRI that was prescribed to treat depression and then ending up with decreased sexual function is not a good thing at all. Not being able to get your dick up is no doubt a pretty shitty thing to have to deal with, even if you're not depressed. And if you are already depressed, then that's just going to make your depression much worse. But why am I talking about this? Well, if you follow my channel, then you'll know that I've made many videos about Post-Finasteride Syndrome, also known as PFS. I have a whole video playlist on PFS that I'll link below. The person who asked me why I haven't covered Post-SSRI Syndrome, also known as PSSD, was implying that by not covering it, I was being deceptive somehow, since he alleged that PSSD is backed by solid clinical research, and if PSSD is real, then that must mean that PFS is also real. That is a fallacious, non sequitur argument, but it is one that I have heard before, so I knew I needed to challenge it. The real reason why I have never covered PSSD before in this channel is because this channel is called Hair Cafe, not Psychology Cafe. So obviously antidepressants are not a germane subject to this channel's focus, which of course is hair loss. But what this kid was implying was that SSRIs, along with finasteride and other drugs and supplements that have been alleged to cause persistent side effects, are all related to each other somehow, and I was obfuscating the truth by not looking into PSSD further, since PSSD somehow validates PFS. In other words, all these post-drug syndromes like post-SSRI syndrome, post-Finasteride syndrome, post-Accutane syndrome, post-Lion's syndrome, post-Saul-Palmetto syndrome, post-whatever the hell you can imagine syndrome, all these syndromes are related because these drugs and supplements are basically all causing the same syndrome. The kid who posted the comment was implying that I was ignoring PSSD because it is accepted as a real syndrome by the medical community. And if PSSD is a real post-drug syndrome, then why wouldn't post-Finasteride syndrome or even post-Saul-Palmetto or post-Lion's syndrome also be real? At least that's the logic that I think this kid was trying to get at. Since all these syndromes all share similar characteristics, then the existence of one of these syndromes, it validates all the others, right? Well, that's a pretty wild assumption, but you know what? Fine. I had no intention of covering this topic, but this kid talked me into it. Since I lack expertise researching this subject, though, the Hair Cafe Institute of Scientific Research and Integrity has decided to hire new talent. Hair loss witchers, meet the newest member of the team, the Woodland Spirit. I paid him a tribute of 5 wolf hearts in exchange for his expertise in researching SSRIs. He's a Leshian researcher who is as old as the oldest trees, so you can rest assured of his expertise in hair loss witchery. And since all these post-drug communities seem to overlap with each other, let's go ahead and go balls deep into PSSD and see what relation, if any, it has to PFS. Before I start, though, I must disclose that unlike finasteride, I do not have a positive opinion about SSRIs. I used several of them back in the 1990s when I was a teenager, and they all gave me horrible sexual side effects. I wouldn't say they gave me any persistent side effects, but they did definitely hurt my confidence as a young man, and it took me a few years before that confidence was fully restored. So, I am covering this topic from the perspective of someone who does not like SSRIs, and I would never touch them again under any circumstances. In fact, it was my bad experience with SSRIs which initially made me scared to stay on finasteride back when I was new to the drug, since what a lot of people were saying about it back then sounded very similar to what I had experienced with SSRIs. That being said, I do acknowledge that SSRIs are still very important drugs that benefit many people, so I'm not going to be one of those people who thinks they need to warn everybody about the dangers of a drug or advocate that a drug should be banned just because I didn't have a good experience with it. That's just arrogant and selfish, and I'm not like that. But in order for me to properly cover this topic, there are three very important questions that I'm going to need to answer. Number one, is PSSD even a real syndrome at all? In other words, has it been proven that SSRI drugs can cause permanent sexual side effects? Question number two, if PSSD is a real syndrome, does that imply that PFS is also a real syndrome? In other words, do we have to accept PFS as a real condition if we accept that PSSD is real? Question number three, even if evidence is lacking that all these post-drug syndromes are real, what could account for the fact that they all have similar features like erectile dysfunction or loss of libido? So first of all, is PSSD even an established syndrome in the medical community at all? Well, SSRI drugs have been around longer than 5-AR inhibiting drugs, and so they have been researched for longer than finasteride or dutasteride. The first ever SSRI drug, which is called fluoxetine, was approved by the FDA way back in 1987, and it's marketed as Prozac. That is 5 years before the first 5-AR inhibitor, finasteride, was approved back in 1992. But back then, it was approved for treating benign prostatic hyperplasia at a dose of 5 milligrams per day, although it was still pretty common for doctors to prescribe it off-label for hair loss even back then. Eventually, a lower dose of finasteride at 1 milligram per day was approved by the FDA for the treatment of androgenic alopecia in 1997. But despite SSRIs and 5-AR inhibitors having a similar community of detractors, the two types of drugs work completely differently. 5-AR inhibitors work by blocking the conversion of testosterone into the trash hormone DHT, which is the hormone that causes hair loss and an enlarged prostate, amongst many other problems. DHT is a paracrine hormone, which means that it works locally where it is produced. That means blocking the 5-AR enzyme reduces the effects of DHT in the tissues where it is produced. Those tissues are predominantly the prostate, the hair follicles, and the skin. So, as a result of this, 5-AR blocking drugs can shrink and enlarge prostate, halt androgenic alopecia, and may even help reduce acne. Although this last benefit is a little less clear, since unlike androgenic alopecia, the causes of acne are highly multifactorial. Also, since sebaceous gland activity in the skin is controlled more by the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme, which finasteride has no significant effect on, it's likely that finasteride has no effect on acne, although dutasteride might have some benefit. What finasteride specifically targets is the type 2 5-AR isoenzyme. So that means that finasteride, contrary to popular belief, does not have any effect on the central nervous system or my neurosteroids. That's because the type of 5-AR isoenzyme that is present in the adult human brain is the type 1 isoenzyme, which again, finasteride has no significant effect on. Unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation about the neurological effects of finasteride that is based on very weak rodent studies. It's not possible to extrapolate the results of rodent studies to human beings because in rodents, unlike in humans, finasteride does affect the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme in the brain. Now, dutasteride, unlike finasteride, does block the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme, but despite this, dutasteride still curiously has not been shown to affect serum neurosteroid levels at a dose of 0.5 milligrams per day. Dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day might theoretically have a more of an effect on neurosteroids, but the evidence from studies done on different doses of dutasteride indicates that increasing doses really aren't associated with an increased risk of side effects. And I go over all that evidence in my video on using 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride, and I'll go ahead and link that video below. There are some theories as to why dutasteride doesn't have more side effects than finasteride, despite being much stronger and despite blocking the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme. One theory is that it could be because its molecular weight is too high for it to pass through the blood-brain barrier. The upper limit of molecular size that crosses the blood-brain barrier is somewhere between 400 and 600 daltons. The molecular weight of dutasteride is 528.53 grams per mole. So it is possible that dutasteride simply does not penetrate the blood-brain barrier or only penetrates it very poorly. Finasteride has a lower molecular weight of 372.549 grams per mole, so finasteride, unlike dutasteride, definitely does penetrate the blood-brain barrier. But, like I said before, it still doesn't have any significant effect on the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme that is in the adult human brain. Even though dutasteride does inhibit the type 1 5-AR enzyme, it has never been proven that dutasteride actually crosses the blood-brain barrier, despite people claiming that it does. Another theory about dutasteride having the same or even lower side effects than finasteride is that even though dutasteride is 100 times stronger at inhibiting the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme than finasteride is, it is still a relatively weak type 1 5-AR blocker at the doses that are normally used. Looking at the chemical data, dutasteride is a much stronger type 2 5-AR blocker than it is a type 1 5-AR blocker, and that is where most of dutasteride's increased efficacy over finasteride comes from. So the effect in the brain of dutasteride on neurosteroid synthesis might be just too small to be important, even if it is much stronger than finasteride. It's also important to realize that side effects from 5-AR inhibitors don't actually come from decreases in serum DHT levels or direct effects on the brain. If that were the case, then everybody would get side effects, since finasteride and dutasteride will dramatically suppress DHT levels in all people who use them. What actually causes side effects from 5-AR inhibitors are the changes they cause to the ratio of testosterone to estrogen, particularly when they are first started. What happens is that the blockade of the 5-AR enzyme causes increased testosterone levels, and some of this extra testosterone can be converted by the aromatase enzyme into estradiol. Depending on how this affects the ratio of testosterone to estrogen, some people may have sexual side effects like a decreased libido, but on the other hand, some people may actually get the opposite effect, specifically increased libido, and you can find many people talking about how drugs like finasteride and dutasteride actually raise their libido. So for most people, these ratios will not change, which is why most people don't get side effects at all. But for those who do get side effects, they'll either get a decrease in libido or an increase in libido, depending on if the ratio favors testosterone or estrogen. Regardless of what happens though, side effects will usually resolve on their own within a few months with continued use as these ratios stabilize on their own. And I talk about all this on my video on what to do if you get side effects on finasteride, which I'll link below. So make sure you watch that if you do have side effects from finasteride or if you're worried about side effects from them. SSRI drugs, on the other hand, work completely differently. They have no relation to 5-AR inhibitors whatsoever. They work directly in the brain by blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitter called serotonin. This results in high serotonin levels in the brain. Low serotonin is associated with depression, so raising brain serotonin levels can help combat depression. However, serotonin also has a lot to do with sexual function. In fact, serotonin, also known as 5-HT, is released after sex, and it accounts for the refractory period men experience after having an ejaculation. So this leads us to one of the biggest differences between SSRIs and 5-AR inhibiting drugs. There is a huge, and I mean absolutely huge, difference in the incidence of sexual side effects between these two types of drugs. Unlike sexual side effects from finasteride or dutasteride, which are very rare, sexual side effects from SSRI drugs are extremely common. And I can speak from personal experience here. Taking an SSRI drug literally feels like taking reverse Viagra or looking at a picture of Laura Loomer. The incidence of sexual side effects with SSRIs depends on the type of SSRI that's actually being used. I mean, some are worse than others, but the incidence can be as high as 75% with certain SSRIs like paroxetine. Overall, we're talking about an incidence of sexual side effects of over 50% for these drugs. That's right, the majority of people who take SSRIs will get sexual dysfunction. In fact, certain types of these drugs are indicated for premature ejaculation by suppressing sexual sensations, like the drug duloxetine that I already mentioned. So it's clear that in order for these drugs to work, it would mean that they would have to have a very high incidence of sexual side effects. Although, as an aside, I should mention that duloxetine is actually a great drug. It is an SSRI, and I know I said that those types of drugs are terrible, but it is a very weak SSRI, and it's weak enough that it reduces penile sensation just slightly without really affecting libido or erectile function at all. So I wouldn't be afraid to try that drug even if you don't respond well to other SSRIs if you want to try to treat premature ejaculation. But as for the SSRIs that are prescribed for depression and anxiety, the side effects are definitely no exaggeration. As one review article states, quote, "Almost all patients who have used SSRIs develop some type of sexual side effect," unquote. On the other hand, finasteride has a much lower incidence of sexual side effects, being of an order of about 2 to 4%. So the incidence of sexual side effects between SSRIs and 5-AR inhibitors isn't even in the same stratosphere. SSRIs are far, far more dangerous than 5-AR inhibitors for your sexual health. Another big difference between the two classes of drugs is that side effects that did not go away upon drug discontinuation have been reported for almost as long as SSRI drugs have been available. With 5-AR blockers, on the other hand, there were no reports of persistent side effects during the initial studies of the drugs, which included thousands of subjects. Reports of persistent side effects, which is what post-finasteride syndrome is based on, only started appearing about a decade or so after finasteride was released on the market, and the drug is one of the most prescribed drugs in the world, especially since it is also used to treat an enlarged prostate. When it comes to SSRIs, though, well, that's another story. The first report of sexual dysfunction continuing after an SSRI was stopped occurred way back in the year 1991. That's the year the Super Nintendo first came out. The first official medical recognition of PSSD syndrome was in 2006, which is 19 years after SSRIs first hit the market. Finasteride, on the other hand, has been on the market for 32 years now, but post-finasteride syndrome is still not a recognized medical condition. However, when it comes to SSRIs, at first the number of reports of PSSD was very low. Only 8 cases were reported in the medical literature between 2006 and 2008. By 2012, there were 19 cases reported in the Netherlands. This low incidence is despite the fact that these are amongst the most commonly prescribed drugs by doctors. In the United States, 1 out of every 8 people have used an SSRI drug in the past 10 years. You can see in this graph that the number of Prozac prescriptions is between 20 million and 30 million per year in the United States. Based on this, the incidence of PSSD based on the initial reports would seem to be exceptionally low, especially since it's just one of many SSRI drugs that are prescribed. Finasteride is prescribed less often, but we're still talking about between 5 million and 10 million prescriptions per year, so finasteride is definitely not some obscure drug. It is still considered the gold standard for fighting hair loss and an enlarged prostate. So finasteride is a very frequently prescribed drug, which makes it especially perplexing why there were no reports of persistent side effects from finasteride until well into the 2000s, over a decade after the drug first hit the market. Keep in mind, PSSD was reported on only 4 years after SSRIs first hit the market. I do think that part of the reason that it took so long for PFS cases to be reported was that the idea of PFS was inspired, at least partly, by the possible existence of PSSD. Back in the early 2010s, there were media reports of finasteride causing depression and suicide. At the same time, it was felt that SSRIs possibly increased the risk of suicide, and there were articles like this one here suggesting that this was true. And so as a result of this, there was a black box warning added to the package insert of drugs like Prozac, saying that these drugs could actually increase the risk of suicide, which seems pretty paradoxical for a drug that's designed to treat depression. Of course, depression is associated with suicide, and people prescribed SSRIs usually have depression, so it was not really clear if this association between SSRI use and suicide was real, or if it was just related to the underlying disease of depression. But if we consider that maybe PSSD was a model for PFS, it's certainly possible that this association led people to believe that there was a similar association between finasteride use and suicide. And actually, as it turns out, the association between finasteride and suicide has been debunked completely, and I talked about that in my videos that I'll link below on the subject. And recently, the link between SSRIs and suicide has also been debunked. In this article here that looked at more than 500,000 patients on SSRIs in Sweden, the risk of suicide actually decreased after starting SSRIs. So I think that many of the supposed features of PFS were inspired by PSSD. The possibility that finasteride could cause persistent side effects and depression were added to the package insert in 2011, which was the same time that the warning that SSRIs could cause suicide was added to the package insert of SSRIs. Regardless of what anyone thinks on the issue, I think it is fair to say that PSSD is a far more established condition than PFS, and most doctors do seem to accept it as a real condition. Both the European Union and Canada added warnings about persistent sexual side effects to the package inserts of SSRIs in 2019. However, even though SSRIs have been around longer than 5-AR inhibitors, the explanation for how sexual side effects could persist after stopping SSRIs is still not clear at all. For example, no one actually has any idea of how PSSD comes about, no more than they have an explanation for the supposed prolonged side effects after taking finasteride. The proposed mechanisms use all the same catchwords that are used with PFS, words like epigenetics, dopamine, neurotoxicity, downregulation, hormonal changes, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. Also, no one knows what the risk of getting PSSD actually is. As one of the review articles concludes, quote, "There is a paucity of data on the frequency, incidence, prevalence, onset, course, and outcomes, comorbidity, demographics, and risk factors of this syndrome arising from the the discontinuation of such a ubiquitous class of medications, SSRIs. Anyways, even if PSSD is a real condition, and I'm not saying that it is, we still can't assume that there is any connection to PFS. Like I already pointed out, SSRI drugs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin in the brain, which leads to increased brain serotonin levels. 5-AR inhibitors work completely differently, so there's no reason to think that the effects of SSRIs would have anything in common with the effects of 5-AR inhibitors. We already pointed out that sexual side effects are much more common with SSRIs than they are with 5-AR inhibitors, which is due to the completely different mechanism of action of the two types of drugs. So there's really no reason to think that both types of drugs would cause a post-drug syndrome with similar side effects. It is possible that an SSRI drug that acts specifically on the brain could have a chance of altering brain function on a permanent basis, though clearly the actual mechanism of this has not been proven yet. But even if most doctors accept that PSSD is real, I think there is still a good reason to have skepticism about the existence of PSSD. That's because there is a big, and I mean a huge, overlap between depression and problems with sexual function, especially in young men. As this article points out, quote, "A lack of sexual drive, decreased sexual desire, and low libido are already established symptoms of depression. Matthew and Weinman stated that decreased arousal was present in 40 to 50% of depressive patients, and 15 to 20% of patients reported problems with orgasm and ejaculation. These can superimpose the sexual dysfunction caused by SSRIs," unquote. The same problem exists with the relationship between finasteride and depression. Although there may be no direct biochemical reason for finasteride to cause depression, we know that hair loss itself can be extremely depressing. So people with hair loss are much more likely to be taking finasteride, and they're also more likely to have depression as a consequence of their hair loss. This is even more true in people who have to stop finasteride due to finasteride side effects, since they are faced with hair loss and they can't take a drug that could reverse their hair loss. Certainly that is definitely a setup for worsening depression. To make things more confusing though, erectile dysfunction in young people frequently has a psychological component. The majority of cases of erectile dysfunction in men less than 35 years old are due to psychological and not organic causes. So someone who develops erectile dysfunction due to an SSRI or even from finasteride, they might continue to have performance anxiety even after the drug has been stopped. This might seem to be a persistent side effect to former SSRI users or finasteride users, but there actually is no direct biochemical link to the drug. And then to come full circle, erectile dysfunction naturally leads to depression, so the whole thing can be a very vicious cycle. So even if PSSD is a real condition, there is nothing in common mechanistically between SSRIs and 5-AR inhibitors. And just to mention some of the other post-drug syndromes that the kid originally brought up, there's also post-Accutane syndrome and post-Lions-Mane syndrome, and I've done videos on both that I'll link below. In the case of Accutane, it can slightly lower DHT levels, but it is not a 5-AR inhibitor. It works by inhibiting the 3-alpha HSD enzyme, which is involved with DHT synthesis via the backdoor pathway. So Accutane is not going to affect neurosteroids in any way, since it doesn't block the 5-AR enzyme that is one of the key steps in the creation of the neurosteroid allopregnanolone. As far as lion's mane mushroom is concerned, there's actually no evidence that it is a 5-AR blocker at all. If it is, it would be a very weak 5-AR blocker, incomparable to many other naturally occurring 5-AR blockers like green tea, onions, and edamame, amongst many others. 5-AR blockers in nature are actually very common, and if any 5-AR blocker could cause post-Finasteride syndrome, they would have people getting PFS from green tea and onions. But what all these post-drug syndromes have in common is that they all supposedly cause similar symptoms. Those symptoms include sexual dysfunction like low libido and erectile dysfunction, as well as depressive symptoms. Sexual problems and depression are all extremely common conditions. The incidence of erectile dysfunction in men between the ages of 40 and 70 was 52%, and you could see that in this large study of over 1,200 men. There was a direct correlation between the severity of erectile dysfunction and depression too. Both erectile dysfunction and depression often occur without any known cause, and they often are chronic with frequent relapses. Often there is no specific abnormal test that can be used to diagnose these conditions, so they are perfect conditions to blame on something like prior drug use. Even if we grant that PSSD is a real condition, that doesn't imply that all these other post-drug syndromes like PFS are valid. Not at all. So before I started doing research on PSSD, I thought that since SSRIs have been around for longer than 5-AR inhibitors, that maybe PFS was essentially based on PSSD. However, now I think the relationship between PSSD and PFS is more complicated than that. I think that the two syndromes have influenced each other. This happened mostly in the decade of the 2010s when social media led to the creation of online forums dedicated to both PSSD and PFS. Both of these post-drug syndromes have been spread by a combination of litigation, stories in the media, and especially anecdotes from online forums and websites. Both PSSD and PFS have inspired numerous lawsuits. Just this year, in fact, the FDA was sued by a scientist for not adding sufficient warnings about persistent sexual side effects to the labels for SSRI drugs. Of course, Merck was also the target of numerous lawsuits relating to Post-Finasteride Syndrome, and I discussed more of that on my video on Merck and the law that I'll link below. But getting back to PSSD and PFS, it is interesting that some of the same doctors that are pushing PFS are also pushing PSSD. For example, here's an article by Dr. Malkanji, who is a well-known member of the Hair Cafe cinematic universe. He's trying to make the case that PFS and PSSD are related. Of course, Dr. Malkanji has written many anti-finasteride articles, and this particular article was supported financially by, you guessed it, the PFS network. But I think that by linking PSSD and PFS together like Dr. Malkanji is doing here in this article, I think he's really weakening the case for PSSD, which is really unfortunate since there is some merit behind the research for PSSD. If anyone who is watching this has PSSD or thinks they have PSSD, I want you to know that as someone who had a very bad experience with antidepressants and who would never touch them again, I feel for you. And even though I am skeptical of PSSD, I haven't ruled out the possibility that it could be a real condition. But by tying what could be a legitimate condition, specifically PSSD, to a completely illegitimate one like PFS, you end up making PSSD sound like a QAnon conspiracy theory, and you're debasing yourself and your movement. I remain open-minded about PSSD, but saying PSSD and PFS are basically the same thing doesn't help make the case for PSSD at all. And yes, just like there is a PFS network funding PFS research, there is also a PSSD network funding PSSD research. And there is an SSRI equivalent of the Propecia Help Forum in the form of the PSSD Forum. But if PSSD proponents want to be taken seriously, they must divorce themselves from these fringe groups that dilute the legitimate research that has been conducted on the long-term side effects of SSRIs. The PSSD community aligning with the PFS network, that's basically the equivalent of doctors aligning themselves with anti-vaxxers. Sure, maybe you'll win the favor of a few tinfoil hat-wearing big pharma conspiracy theorists, but the PSSD salvation will not come from those idiots, it will come from the medical community, not fringe conspiracy theorists. So, getting back on subject, let me summarize my answers to the questions I posed at the beginning of this video. Number 1, is PSSD a real syndrome? Well, I would say it's still unknown at this point, though like I said before, SSRIs have much more powerful effects on sexual function than 5-AR inhibitors do, so maybe they can cause prolonged sexual problems. One problem, though, is that once someone experiences sexual problems from one of these drugs, there can be psychological problems superimposed that perpetuate sexual side effects even when the physical problem is no longer there. Like PFS, PSSD is based on anecdotal evidence without proof of causality, and there's no mechanism that has been shown definitively to cause persistent side effects. It may be acknowledged as something real by doctors, but fundamentally it remains difficult to pin down. At the very least, though, the case for PSSD is much stronger than the case for PFS. Number 2. Even if PSSD is real, I don't think it has anything to do with PFS or any other supposed post-drug syndrome. SSRIs have nothing in common with 5-AR inhibitors mechanistically. Number 3, I think the reason all these post-drug syndromes seem similar to each other is that they all purport to cause erectile dysfunction and depression, which are both very common conditions that are easy to blame on something like prior drug use, but the evidence is severely lacking that they are actually caused by these drugs. Like I said, when you add into this mix a whole bunch of litigation and toxic fear-mongering by social media, you will see more and more post-drug syndromes arising as a result of social media contagion. If we were to just start spreading the word that onion and green tea are 5-AR inhibitors, which they are, you will start to hear more and more people claim to have post-onion syndrome or post-green tea syndrome. I guarantee it. The only reason it hasn't happened yet is because these foods being 5-AR inhibitors isn't exactly common knowledge, so the widespread nocebo-induced delusion hasn't happened yet, but maybe it will after this video. We'll see. Anyways, I think the PSSD organization and individuals who tie their condition to PFS are actually hurting the PSSD movement, and they don't even realize it. By trying to treat PSSD and PFS as equivalent conditions, all it does is it creates a lot of extra noise, and this extra noise and drama makes it a lot harder for researchers to focus specifically on PSSD. And this will continue to be a huge problem so long as everybody keeps insisting that PSSD is this broader condition caused by all this other bullshit like finasteride, Accutane, lion's mane, saw palmetto, broccoli, Rob's prostate massage, etc., etc. So I recommend that we take a step back and take a pure approach to PSSD and study it as a separate condition without trying to lump it together with PFS and a whole bunch of other bogus post-drug syndromes. PSSD groups should not link themselves to PFS groups because the extremely poor quality data produced by so-called PFS research, it pollutes the higher quality data that has been researched on PSSD. So this video was pretty long, and I definitely appreciate anyone who watched to the end, but the bottom line here is that the PFS community is not a friend to the PSSD community. PSSD doesn't have anything at all to do with PFS, and any research validating PSSD is completely unrelated to PFS. The PSSD community has voices in it that deserve to be heard by the medical community, and the sooner the PSSD community can kick the PFS ass clowns out of their movement completely, the more likely it is that PSSD will be taken seriously so that the sufferers of antidepressant side effects will get the recognition they richly deserve. So that's all I have to say about PSSD, at least for now, because we need to get back to more hair loss witchery in the near future. So I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you for watching. God bless.